All right, guys, today we're going to talk about cultural conflicts. Now, a lot of you probably had political debates with your friends or your neighbors or your parents, and obviously those are cultural conflicts, but cultural conflicts are not confined specifically to politics. Cultural conflicts can include religious debates, ethical debates, moral debates, anything that pits people's perspectives of reality and humanity against each other. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is nativism. This was an idea that came about in the 19th century. It was a response to Irish and Chinese immigration. Now, during the Irish potato famine, huge numbers of Irish immigrated to the United States. It settled in cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and even today there's a huge Irish influence, especially in cities like Boston. Think about the Boston Celtics. That's actually a reference to the Irish population in that city. There are actually more descendants of Irish in the United States than there are in Ireland, believe it or not. So the nativism was basically an opposition to this whole idea. They felt like America belonged to what they viewed as Native Americans, Americans from the Anglican, Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist backgrounds who hailed from countries like England, Scotland, and Wales. And they felt that Catholic Irish were not racially equal to them and were not culturally equal to them, and that they would vote how the Pope told them to vote rather than vote on their education or their conscience. And there was a lot of racial belief that the Irish would drink too much and would get in fights and were not productive members of society. Obviously, this was not the case, and many Irish went on to serve in the Civil War and helped to build a lot of America's great cities. And obviously, the same sentiment was equivalent with the Chinese. It was much more directed toward the Chinese on the West Coast rather than on the East Coast, and it actually resulted in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where Chinese were not allowed to bring wives over to the United States, and many Chinese ended up having to immigrate back to China. And it's kind of a sad story because so many of these Chinese actually helped to build stuff like the Transcontinental Railroad. And then during the 1840s to the 1920s, there was a lot of animosity toward German immigrants um, who were viewed as isolated in their own communities and wouldn't reach out to their fellow Americans. And obviously, during the First World War, they became this animosity grew a lot. There was a lot of sentiment that German immigrants were spies for the Kaiser or were somehow less loyal to the United States. And then, obviously, in World War II, that cropped up again, also with the Japanese, got the internment camps. And after World War I, there was a lot of animosity toward Jews, immigrants from Southeast Europe, and Catholics. A lot of the animosity toward Jews was based on, frankly, false beliefs that Jews controlled the media or the banks, and that they were somehow conspiring to have undue influence on the country. Um, and this idea received a lot of credence because it was endorsed by people like Henry Ford and Walt Disney, who uh, who were very popular and very influential figures at that time period. Now, it's strange to think of the Back to Africa movement as controversial. What the Back to Africa movement was the idea that freed slaves should return to Africa. Now, this had a lot of support from really unlikely quarters. A lot of current actually slave holders during that time period supported free slaves returning to Africa because they were afraid that they would become involved in the abolitionist movement. A lot of Quakers who were really wealthy actually felt that it was sin to keep their brothers in Christ in slavery, especially as more and more blacks converted to Christianity. And eventually this resulted in the American Colonization Society, which was founded in 1816, and Liberia became founded in 1821 as a refuge for American blacks. This was not done as a colony of sorts. It was actually a genuine refuge where blacks could receive land and property, and Liberia went on to gain independence in 1847. Unfortunately, a lot of the blacks who moved there ended up dying from various diseases and starvation. And obviously, during Reconstruction, with the growth of the Ku Klux Klan and violence and terrorism, there a lot of interest redeveloped in this idea. And the guy you see on the right, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, he was actually a Jamaican immigrant who became really influential in the movement toward resettlement, and he actually owned his own ship that would ferry freed slaves back to Africa. But the reason it was so controversial was that a lot of blacks who had received their independence felt like that, they'd lived in the United States for generations. They had no connection to Africa. They didn't want to return home, and they viewed a lot of the blacks who endorsed resettlement in Africa as almost like traitors or Uncle Toms. And as a lot of blacks were moving north into traditionally white cities like the time Cleveland, St. Louis, even Chicago, there became a lot of racial animosity and even racial violence. And um, the Back to Africa movement was viewed as an alternative to that. So modernism. All right, so modernism. Modernism was an alternative to Enlightenment thinking that came about in the late 19th century. It was really opposed by religious groups who viewed it as a traditional breaking away of the old social norms and the old mentality of how to do things. And it embraced all new kinds of thinking, like art with impressionists, psychology with guys like Sigmund Freud. He was talking about how human behavior was based on our relationships with our parents and our friends and how we grow up, and ideas about philosophy that human behavior should be based on emotion, and architectural, historically architecture had been based on Greek and Roman designs, and they started thinking about high-rise buildings and modernist building structures, and even ideas like humanity, that our personal relationships were more important than our social relationships. All right, so in many respects, fundamentalism was the opposite of the modernist movement. It was sort of the antithesis to the new thesis of modernist thinking, and it emphasizes strict literalism of the Bible. That obviously Jesus with the virgin birth, and that Christ's death was atonement for sin, and Jesus performed miracles, and that the Bible is infallible. So obviously, this was quite hostile to modernist thinking. Actually, came about from a group of religious scholars at Princeton University, and rejected a commonality with Christianity and Judaism. And obviously, today, fundamentalism is still alive in many circles, especially in rural parts of this country. All right, so the Black Power movement sprung up during the Civil Rights Movement. It was kind of a rejection of the sort of Martin Luther King nonviolence uh, attitude towards civil rights, especially grew after his assassination, and a lot of the frustration that a lot of blacks felt about being isolated and excluded from uh, mainstream society, and a sense that they were never going to become part of the American mainstream. So it became increasingly radical, increasingly factionalized. Groups like the Black Panthers advocated for violence when necessary. There was large-scale arming of the inner cities, which we still experience some repercussions from today. But it did advocate a lot of positive things too, as well as like community control, um, so large-scale social work, and interdependence of our communities. But it was opposed fiercely by a lot of whites who viewed it as a threat to their safety and their well-being, and obviously the social structure as well. So the women's movement is obviously a movement still going on today. There have been three waves of feminism. The first was the suffrage and political equality movement. This advocated for women, the basic right for women to vote. The second was combated social and cultural inequality. It advocated that women should be able to hold jobs as well as be mothers. The third is the wave we're in today that advocates for equal pay for equal work, and a splitting of parental responsibilities between fathers and mothers, and that there can be true gender equality both in the workplace and at home. And throughout the entire history of the feminist movement, it's been opposed by a lot of fundamentalist religious groups, including many evangelicals and uh, many Baptist congregations that felt like it denied the basic um, the basic gender norms that they viewed as being God-given, and really challenged a lot of ideas about a woman's place in society as women moved from being mothers and homemakers to you know equal members of society, uh, and he even argued that men should become equally responsible in, cleaning and child rearing. All right, so the countercultural movement grew up after the Beat Generation and the Civil Rights Movement, and obviously John F. Kennedy talking about how ask not what your country can do, ask what you can do for your country. It's a term actually coined by John Milton Yinger, and it advocated for civil rights, ending the war in Vietnam, ending the draft, women's rights, LGBT rights, and environmental protections. A lot of the young people felt like they were being sent into a war in Vietnam. They had really no stake in the outcome, and they engaged in frequent protests, both on college campuses and in Washington and a lot American cities all across the country. Obviously, as the war dragged on and they felt like they weren't experiencing any significant results, there was burning of draft cards and ultimately bombings in the 1970s until the United States ultimately pulled out of Vietnam. All right, so there was a lot of pushback against the countercultural movement, especially from the older generation who'd grown up and fought in the Second World War and were highly opposed to anything they felt like was critical of the country or supportive of communism. And many of the young people did become supportive of people like Ho Chi Minh and Chairman Mao as the 60s and early 70s rolled on. And a lot of the older generation felt like the young people were going to cost them the war in Vietnam and ultimately lead to a domino effect in Southeast Asia that would cost them ultimately their own freedom as more and more of the world fell to communism. And you have to understand in this period, a lot of people believe there was a vast international communist conspiracy that was dictating a lot of the events and behaviors of people all over the world. So our final point, obviously, is the Wilmington Race Riots. This is an important local event. Actually, I don't know if any of you know this, but Wilmington is the only place in the United States that has ever had a coup d'etat or a forceful overturn of local government. And it was an event that happened during Reconstruction when a lot of blacks were in control of local government because a lot of the whites were not allowed to vote. And there was basically a mob movement, and they removed a lot of blacks from power. Many blacks were murdered, and there was violence and raping, and it was a really horrible situation. But obviously, it was highly controversial, and actually, the federal government did not intervene in this event. So a lot of blacks ended up moving out of Wilmington as a result of this, and still today it has reverberations in our social structure here in Wilmington, North Carolina. All right, guys, this brings us to our assignment. Basically, you're going to look at several political cartoons here. These were all taken from these different time periods. Obviously, the first one is about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the immigration, the Return to Africa movement, the modernist movement, the fundamentalist movement. This is about the Black Power movement and the women's rights movement and the countercultural movement, and finally the Wilmington Race Riots. So your job essentially is to look at the cartoon and analyze it both from your perspective and from the perspective of people who lived at that time period. So, how do you feel about the cartoon? How would people at that time have felt about the cartoon? Imagine put yourself in their shoes, in their position, and try to visualize their mentality. So, this is the basic rubric. Basically, you're going to be graded on two things. You're going to be graded on thoughtfulness and relevance. So, you should pull pertinent information from our discussion and essentially show that you thought about what the articles and provide me concise, thoughtful responses. So obviously, a poor response would be a one-word response. To a question like "How do you feel?" You'd be like, "Well, fine." Obviously that would only get you 1 point. If you say, "Well," so with the Wilmington Race Riots, imagine that you're an African American who'd just been kicked out of Wilmington. People who died in these race riots. How would that make you feel? Versus how if you were a white living in that same time period who had just been part of those race riots, how would that make you feel? It's an important point to think about and evaluate before you really delve into this assignment. So good luck, guys.